Hello, everyone, and welcome to the stream. I am accompanied today by Michael Rossi. This is my first interview, and he's my first interviewee. So I want you all to welcome him very nicely. He is a professor at a. I think it's best if you just introduce yourself, and then we can get on with it.
Yeah, I'm sort of the wandering academic these days. Have syllabus, will teach. So I'm currently residing in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, which is it's a fascinating city, and it's the Webster University's campus. It's an American university. They have campuses all over the world. Here I am in Tashkent. It's one of the largest and one of the most dynamic. I'm also associated with Long Island University, Brooklyn, where I have my office, back in the States. I've also taught for more than 20 years in the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University, which is also based in New Jersey in the United States. I've taught at the College of New Jersey, Rowan University, Fordham University, and some of you may have heard of this little small community college called Princeton. I was only there for just one semester, but enough to add to my resume here. But I am talking to you all now from Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Just believe me, even though the wall behind me is completely white. But it's about 8 p.m. here, so even if I wanted to show you what it looked like outside, it's already dark.
So as you all can hear, he is very qualified to be here, and I am just honored to have him on board.
We'll let the viewers decide.
Yeah.
We'll let the viewers decide.
All right.
Yeah.
So this stream is going to mainly be an interview where I have some questions for Professor Michael, and then we will go on to answer questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, please comment them down below. I'll pick some and we'll discuss those. So the topic for today is Russian foreign policy and the war in Ukraine. So welcome everyone to the stream, and let's begin. So the first question I have for you is, what are your thoughts in general that Russia's current position is on the world stage?
Mm-hmm. These are just my thoughts. And so they're not necessarily definitive, but I do echo a lot of the opinions and assessments of other international relations scholars, in particular, the very well-known Professor John Mearsheimer. So I don't know if you know him or if your viewers know him. Professor Mearsheimer is, one of the last great realists of the world here, and he has been extensively publishing and defending the theory, the philosophy of realism now for more than 30 years. And, he's having somewhat of a good moment right now in the fact that his predictions that go all the way back to the early 1990s are correct. He seems almost vindicated. I agree with him to a certain extent. Within the international relations school of theory, I tend to be more of a constructivist than a realist. And a constructivist is, I like to think of constructivism not so much as a theory, but as I've said in my lecture videos, like a downloadable mod to make the existing theory work better. Like the vanilla mod is realism.
Yeah.
Constructivism just adds a little better graphics, a little better play value, and it kind of takes us, a little bit further. So Mearsheimer, like most realists, they're good about 80% of the time, but you need the next 20% to really move forward here. So, but by that way of saying, I agree with Mearsheimer, and I believe that Russia's position is that of a regional power, right? It is a regional power in the world today. It is a rising power. One could even say a returning power from that of the 1990s. We can talk more about this extensively later on, but Russia, and more specifically, when we talk about Russian foreign policy, we really have to talk about the thoughts of two people, Russian President Vladimir Putin and equally important Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Now, both Putin and Lavrov seem to have read their IR studies. They seem to have read Mearsheimer. They seem to have read Sam Huntington. And so they use the term multipolarism a lot. They talk about the end of American unipolarism after what is more 15 or so years here. So Russia sees itself as a regional power, not a global power. And I don't think that there really is a global power anymore. Maybe the United States is sort of a waning global power. It sees itself as a regional power, particularly in the areas of the former Soviet Union, minus the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. So that means the other, 12, 11 former Soviet republics. It sees itself as a regional power in the Middle East. And it sees itself as, if nothing else, an influential power in parts of Eastern Europe, right? Specifically the Balkans, the areas of the former Soviet Union. If it has an ideology, it's a type of ideology that is called sovereign democracy. And I mentioned this a couple of times in my lecture videos, but the term sovereign democracy is not invented by me. It's a term that was coined by this one Russian official, Vladislav Sukharov. And it's hard to describe exactly what sovereign democracy is, but it fits within the general understanding of national conservatism, the primacy of the state as the sovereign actor in the international arena. And as such, sovereign democracy promotes the idea, right, that states, not international organizations, are the deciding factors, are the ones that have the greatest sense of choice for its people. It doesn't necessarily mean that organizations like the UN are irrelevant, but that states like Russia or Belarus or India or China or where I'm from, Uzbekistan or Hungary or Serbia or Turkey, whatever, should have, right, the final say on their national interests and should not have to surrender those interests to either organizations like NATO or the EU, or feel like they have to be subordinate to other great powers like the United States. And this is kind of where sovereign democracy kind of leads us, is that Russia sees itself as a leading member of what we'll just euphemistically call the rest. We have the West and we have the rest. This is kind of a subtle hint at Sam Huntington's work, The Clash of Civilizations. But I'm not a fan of Huntington. I've read his work multiple times. I think that he was right about his predictions about the post-Cold War world eventually becoming multipolar, and that the West was being one of many civilizations. I don't necessarily agree with his history. I think it's very broad stroked. I think that there's a lot of things that did not come to fruition. But Huntington was correct in saying that the more that the West sees itself as this moral guide for the rest of the world to develop, mature, modernize, industrialize, the more the rest is going to see this as problematic. And they're going to look for ways to either deter Western influence, especially when it comes to politics, or find alternatives to that. Russia sees itself as a country that is powerful enough, influential enough to provide an alternative. Now, what that alternative is specific to every country and region, but the alternative is alternative to Western neoliberalism and Western liberal democracy. It doesn't mean that it is undemocratic or anti-democratic, but it does mean that it sees Western liberal democracy as something unfamiliar and unacceptable to large parts of the world. So if countries like Russia are going to engage in sovereign democracy, and democracy here is the operative word, then democracy will be not so much this cookie cutter type of model franchised out from the West, but each country, Russia included, is going to find ways in which democracy can be custom designed. for their own cultural values, traditional legacies, and collective social acceptance. Hence the gravitation towards national conservatism, more towards liberal cosmopolitanism.
So to conclude your point, would I be correct? And this leads up to the next question, and also why I invited you onto this show, because a lot of my viewers are watching because they want to see the updates on the war in Ukraine. But I want to make sure that everyone doesn't just know what's happening on the field, but also on the global stage, which is where diplomacy plays its part. So, would you say that in its road to create an alternative to the West, that this war in Ukraine has given them an opportunity to show the world that they can stand up against the West and fight against them? So, my next question is, what is Russia's diplomatic aim with the current war in Ukraine?
So you framed the question in a different context from what I had sort of prepared myself
Okay.
for, but I'm
Yeah.
glad, but I'm glad that you did. You're absolutely right in that we need to look beyond the military aspects of the war because, I'm going to sort of jump ahead here. Ukraine's fate is not good, right? I'm gonna just put it that way, right? Ukraine's fate is not good. I don't see Ukraine somehow winning the war, kicking the Russians out. It's not going to happen. And we'll talk about the peace of settlements and what Ukraine will look like afterwards. But the diplomatic outcome, and some would even say fallout from this, right, is that Ukraine is it's the catalyst for non-Western neoliberal states to challenge this sense of Western neoliberal hegemony. But a challenge that I have to say, I mean, we're talking here, this is 2020. This isn't 2002, certainly not 1992. So we're not looking at Western neoliberalism in its heyday. We're talking about a philosophy that has already gone through the negative aspects of globalization, the 08-09 economic fallout, the draconian consequences that come to a country like Greece, which, had it not been in the European Union, it might have taken different approaches to its economic solutions. But instead, right, there was only one recipe, and that was austerity, and it almost comes at the cost of destroying the sovereignty of a country. We're talking about a challenge to neoliberal Western hegemony in the absence, in the post-Trump era, right? So someone like Donald Trump has shown that this way of thinking is not even popular at home. We're talking about it in the aftermath of Afghanistan. And I think that this was the big one, in that the United States had decided to pull out of Afghanistan. And we hadn't even finished doing that. And the Taliban had taken over the country, like wiping out 20 years of whatever it was that we claim to have been in. So to then look at this question, what is Russia's diplomatic aim with the current war in Ukraine, is, if nothing else, to show those that are observing that there is an alternative to Western liberal hegemonic foreign policy. Now, what that is, like I said in the first question, particular to each state and region. And it's, we cannot forget that Russia has its own national interests as well. Like, Russia is not intervening in Ukraine simply for the philanthropic sense of reminding people that there's that there's a world out there beyond American hegemony. Right? Russia invaded another country. We have to be perfectly clear with that. Right? Russia has its own military objectives in Ukraine. It has its own political aims in Ukraine. And its message, its ethos, if one follows it, is a way of halting NATO's expansion, providing an economic alternative to the European Union, Whether or not that resonates among Ukrainians has, still remains to be seen here. But I think that, at least as far as Ukraine itself is concerned, let me just get specific with Ukraine and then just kind of go a little bit broader here, right? So Russia's diplomatic aim with Ukraine itself is really two things. And both Putin and Lavrov have been pretty consistent on this. Number one is the military neutralization of Ukraine, right? The goal is to get the Ukrainian government to declare military neutrality, forget any hope of ever joining NATO, and just kind of serving as this neutral buffer zone between Russia and NATO. The second objective, and this is a bit more interpretive, is what they refer to as the denazification of Ukraine. And the narrative here is that while someone like Volodymyr Zelensky may not necessarily be a neo-Nazi, his government and his decisions have been largely influenced, if not outwardly exploited, by this, ever-present yet highly phantasmic Ukrainian far right that espouses symbols and narratives and historical memories that are very much akin to Nazi ethnocentrism, racism, xenophobia. It's a type of Ukrainian national identity that seeks to de-Russify what it means to be a Ukrainian, de-Sovietize, decommunize. And the problem is that finding Ukrainian national heroes and patriots that are not connected to Russia or the Soviet Union, whether these are the only people available or whether this is a deliberate policy by its perpetrators, are people that collaborated with the Nazis. And as such, right, are anti-Russian, anti-Soviet, and people that are willing to destroy the country's history, heritage, and tradition for the sake of joining this loose confederation of European states. So this leads to the broader aspect of what Russia's diplomatic aim is, and that is to show that countries like Ukraine or Syria or Libya, right, or Georgia or Serbia or anyone else for that matter does not need to look to the West or does not need to feel like they have no other choice but to be exploited by the West in order to modernize, develop, and democratize. So we go back to this notion of the rest being this alternative set of identities and values to what Russia sees as, an American, British, NATO franchise.
Very interesting. I like your point about how they are, because I have the same view on the Ukrainians trying to, rather than de-Russify, then I would rather say Ukrainianize Ukraine, make it so that all Ukrainians are their form of Ukrainian, similar to how neoliberalism wants everyone to be liberal. So we saw that with how they somewhat, or at least rather than banned, very limited the Russian language in Ukraine. So yeah, I think you're making some very good points on that aspect.
So let me just jump in here, because this is I want to talk about this whole notion of Ukrainianization of Ukraine, and this is a rather delicate subject to mention. Now, I want to just mention I'm no expert. I'm no expert on Ukrainian domestic politics in this sense, right? So there's other sources out there that are far more authoritative, but the notion of the Ukrainianization of Ukraine is already problematic because we're talking about what seems to be the top-down, state-sponsored imposition of a mono-ethnic culture on a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic state, right? Ukraine has always been a multi-ethnic, heterogeneous state. And even the question of who identifies as Ukrainian it varies by region. So there are those that live in Ukraine that identify as Ukrainian, but they speak Russian as their primary language, right? They don't speak Ukrainian, or if they do, rudimentary form of Ukraine. Let me just give a side example here, right? I'm going to use the country that I'm currently residing in, Uzbekistan, right? Where I am living in Tashkent, and I've been to Samarkand and Bukhara and other places, Russian is ubiquitous. The Russian language is ubiquitous. The students that are at my university, they all speak Russian to each other, but they're not Russian. They're Uzbek or they're Tajik. They might have some Russian blood in them. There's a few Armenians, a few here or there. They all speak Russian. Now you ask them, "Are you Russian?" They say, "Of course not. I'm not Russian. I'm my identity." The same goes for Ukraine, right? The same goes for Ukraine. Is that Russian is just simply the language that you grew up and spoke with. And prior to the 2014 Euromaidan movement that toppled the corrupt government of Yanukovych and replaced it with the corrupt government of Petro Poroshenko, every major Ukrainian city, except for Lviv in the west, was primarily a Russian-speaking city. Now, how many of them identified as Russian as opposed to Ukrainian? Now, that's a different story. You might get more people that identify as Russian in Crimea or Donbass, but certainly in Odessa, in Mariupol, in Kharkiv, in Dnipropetrovsk, in Kiev, you ask them, "What are you?" They'll tell you that they are a Ukrainian while saying it in Russian, right? My personal favorite is that in Uzbekistan, right? It's a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic country as well. One of my favorite places to go to is Samarkand, right? And is the capital of the Silk Road. It is primarily an ethnic Tajik city. The language of the city there, they speak a dialect of Persian, but that doesn't make them Tajik. They don't identify as Tajik, all of them. They might identify as Uzbek, but this is the other thing. They will tell you that they are not Tajik, but Uzbek, but they'll say it to you in Russian. And this is just what I think baffles the mind of many in the West about the multilinguistic heterogeneous identities. So to impose now this idea that we're only going to speak Ukrainian, Russian language is not going to be used in schools, the Russian, Russian history, Russian literary figures. I mean, when we end up, and I hate to use this word cancel because I'm not part of this cancel. I hate cancel, but we're just going to say it anyway because everybody knows it.
Yeah.
When we decide to cancel Yuri Gagarin, when we cancel Pushkin, when we cancel Tchaikovsky, I mean, for God's sake, now all of a sudden you are antagonizing people that otherwise would have been part of a Ukrainian state to now feel that they're an alienated minority. And when they're no longer seen as welcome in this new mono-ethnic Ukrainian state that is largely being defined by members of the Ukrainian far right-wing political factions, I mean, they either leave the country or they feel that they have to gravitate towards Russia for some kind of protection, right, and support. Right. So I wanted to follow up with this because the language issue and this idea of what does it mean to be a Ukrainian, and if it's a very mono-ethnic, xenophobic approach to Ukrainianism, it cuts out a lot. And this isn't particular to Ukraine. We could do the same thing in any of these multi-ethnic Central Asian countries. If some political movement in Uzbekistan was to suddenly come up with this idea that we want Uzbekistan for the Uzbeks, and we're only going to be speaking the Uzbek language, well, then you jeopardize by losing at least 75% of your country. I mean, so if you want to do that, I mean, knock yourself out. But I mean, and I was in Kazakhstan last weekend. I mean, Russian is spoken even more in that area, right? It's just, like English is spoken in India.
Yeah.
And it's not because everybody's an Anglophone, because the language it's useful. Because a Tajik is not going to speak Uzbek, and Uzbek is not going to speak Armenian. They're all going to speak Russian. So it's a politically neutral and all-inclusive language, which I think a lot of people in the West don't understand.
Very interesting points. All right, moving on to the next question. This is a bit different from the others. This one is, what is your assessment on how the war is progressing? So to give a bit of background to this question, I will present my map. And so essentially what we're seeing is that there has been a stalemate for the past couple of months. There has been small changes on the front line, but these past week or two, the Ukrainians have started a counterattack in the Kherson front and in the Izium region, where they've seen a lot of success in the Izium front. So that's a quick rundown on the situation.
Right. Um, so up until, let's say, the last couple of weeks, I think
Mm-hmm.
it was pretty obvious that Russia had the tactical advantage. Russia controls anywhere from 20 to 25% of Ukrainian territory. They completely control the oblast of Luhansk. They control about 2/3, to my estimation, of Donetsk. They also control large areas in the Mariupol region, the Zaporozhye region, the Kherson region. I think it became pretty serious when Russia finally captured Mariupol, right? That was the
Mm-hmm.
big one. The question then was, what's Russia's end goal? What are they hoping to accomplish? Obviously, in the last week or so, there has been, much talk of this Ukrainian counteroffensive, as you rightly point
Mm-hmm.
out. There is a Kherson counteroffensive, and more recently, the Izium one. The Kherson offensive has largely proven to be a disaster as far as the Ukrainian side is concerned. And as far as Kiev has been indicating, this might have been just a bluff. Right? It might have been a ruse as a way of getting Russia to move all of its forces down there while they attack from Kharkiv. If that really is the case, I really don't want to be the father or the mother of my killed son that was sacrificed in a ruse. If that really was the case, Zelensky or
Mm-hmm.
the Ukrainian military high command it just shows how little they care about their own people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Izium one is still up in the air. And over the past couple of days, the Ukrainian forces have made some significant inroads into Russian occupied territory. And now I'm following a number of Telegram channels, which I'm sure you have and everyone outside the United
Yeah.
States does. Everyone follows Telegram, right? So there's a number of ones that I'm following. And by last check, the Ukrainian army did take Balakleya, which was a strategic town.
Mm-hmm.
And they are effectively looking to at least control the highway onto Izium, so the city is blocked off. So they want to kind
Mm-hmm.
of do to Izium what Russia did to Mariupol.
Yeah.
By my last Telegram check, there has been a significant amount of resupply of the Russian military front
Mm-hmm.
up to that area. My guess, and again, this is only a guess here, is that the Ukrainian army will not reach Izium. This is a disaster as far as Putin is concerned. But we also have to think about this. Both offensives, Kherson and Izium, are coming in the days before and following a major in Ramstein, in which
Wait, if we just hold
towns.
for a second. The
Yes,
connection is stuttering, and I would like you to repeat the last 10 seconds.
sure.
Thank you.
Okay. So what we need to understand here, right, is the counteroffensives in both Kharkiv
Mm-hmm.
and Izium are coming in the days preceding and days following a major meeting in Ramstein in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
where various ministers of defense, the Secretary of Defense in the United States is meeting with Ukrainian officials to decide whether or not they will deserve the next round of weapons, the next round of supplies. Here we are 6 months into the conflict, and it's kind of grinded down to just this stalemate. I think the Russian strategy is just to hold the line and just grind out as many Ukrainian forces as possible, right? Territorial defense units are just getting ripped to shreds. We find that many Ukrainian army battalions army companies are deserting. They don't want to go to the front and fight. They feel that they are not well equipped. There was an article in the Washington Post published about a day or two ago, right, about the cost of these counteroffensives and whether or not it's worth doing. So my guess, and this is only a guess, is that the amount of time, diplomacy, and money that has been afforded to Ukraine comes with an expiration date. And I think that Zelensky was told in some way, look, if you can't show that you can take this on the offensive, if you can't regain territory, we're running out of weapons. Are basically they're depleting their military resources. So they're wondering, like, show us that you can do something in order to qualify for the next round.
Yeah.
And this, I think, may explain the counteroffensive. So even if they don't succeed in gaining any ground, if nothing else, if the Ukrainian army just ends up taking just a few small villages outside of Izium, they might turn that around and say, well, you see what we can do with a small amount.
Yeah.
Imagine what we can do with even a bigger amount. Look, there's money to be made in this war. There's profits to be made. I don't own stock in Raytheon, but for those who do, I'm sure your portfolios are looking quite good, pretty good right now. But to answer this question is, the war is Russia still holds the tactical advantage, and the big question is, will Ukraine be able to push the Russian forces back to the 2014 to the February 2022 starting point? Will they be able to push it back to 2014? I doubt it. Will they be able to retake Crimea? I doubt it. Will they be able to retake Mariupol or Melitopol or even Kherson? I don't think. I could be wrong, but right now it doesn't seem that the evidence is there.
To support your final point, I completely agree with the assessment that it is at the very least very difficult for the Ukrainians to reach their official goals, which Zelensky has claimed to retake all Ukrainian territory, including the Donbas and Crimea. You see, the situation right now is that yes, the Ukrainians have managed to retake a significant area in the Kharkiv region. However, the issue here is that the Russian tactic has so far been that whenever the Ukrainians go on a counterattack, they will pull back their forces and launch artillery strikes on them so that they receive the least possible amount of casualties, as they value their soldiers' lives over the territory. And they want to inflict as many casualties as possible on the enemy. And we have to remember that so far, Russian involvement in Ukraine numbers about 250,000 soldiers, which is very significant. However, this is only about 20 to 25% of their army, meaning they still have about 50 cards to play. They have a lot of weapons they haven't used. They are barely using the air force. It's very expensive to do so. They have sent 250,000 troops. They can send 1 million. So there's a lot of options they have on the table, and they aren't using those. Now we see the Ukrainians successfully push through Russian defenses. However, if we look at all the locations, we saw, for example, that strategic city, Playbyplay, or whatever it was called. There were some Russian troops who ended up being encircled. However, the Russians pushed through to hold the highway open for as long as possible to keep as many back with them. So they decided to give up on the city and pull back as many forces as they can. This shows that they have consistently been trying to keep as many soldiers alive as possible and don't care about the territory at all. The reason why we're seeing so much effort being put into the south is because this gap, the Dnieper River, is something that you can't just easily pass through, meaning that the fact that they already control Kherson means that they essentially have this bridge to the other side of the Dnieper River. However, they are still able to give up on Kherson and have no issue, because at the start of the war we saw that Russia is willing to use Belarusian territory to cross into Ukraine. Meaning, if they ever get pushed out of Kherson and get pushed over to the other side of the Dnieper River, they can always just advance from the north through Belarusian territory. So all in all, Russia can give up all the territory it has in Ukraine, but Ukraine will still suffer from the economic drawbacks, the political drawbacks, and all of these things, and Russia can just go in again, because they are avoiding their losses. As Mao Zedong said back 60 years ago, 70 years ago, if you give up If you try to keep your men in a losing battle, you will lose the men and you will lose the territory. If you pull back your men, you will lose the territory but keep the men, which is what Russia is doing. They're keeping their men, losing the territory. So yeah, that's my assessment of the situation. Before we move on to the next question, there's a donation from the chat, a $10 donation from Daniel Tucker. Thank you very much. Can Russia turn this disaster into an opportunity? This is the largest concentration of Ukrainian forces in the wide open. How long can Ukraine hold these lines this deep into Russian territory? So, as Professor Michael mentioned, there is a lot of videos recently about Russian reinforcements to Izium. And allegedly, this is the Third Army Corps, which has been created purely to get involved into this Ukrainian invasion. So Russia has created a army of about 40 to 50,000 soldiers that have trained for 3 months of volunteers who have previously been in the army. So this are similar to reservists. So 3 months training to 50,000 reservists into Izium right now, meaning that they have a huge opportunity for a counterattack as the situation is right now. So generally speaking, yes, they can turn this into a huge opportunity. However, it depends on their tactical ability to make use of their now superior numbers, and also their willingness to commit to losing the men that they have prepared. That is my assessment. Do you have any comments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was listening in here, and if I find it, there is this brilliant YouTube channel that does like play-by-play assessments of the war as it's going on. I don't have the. I wish that I had the name of it. And within the interview, when I come of it, I really would like to promote it. I don't know the owner of the channel personally, but it's one of the most precise military assessments of it. And I'd like to give a shout out to that channel. If the Izium offensive, counteroffensive, is anything like the Kherson one, it's going to be Russian forces pull back, stretch out the Ukrainian military supply lines, and then just bombard them with as much artillery as possible. You're also right in talking about the loss of Balakleya was not that the city was conquered by the Ukrainians, but the Russians had pulled out, exactly as you said, right? They held out long enough to negotiate a tactical withdrawal. They gave up the city, and they're still fighting in some parts of the city as well, right? The Ukrainians have not yet taken the entire city, but what they are doing is, just like the Kherson offensive, giving these little penetrated lines that go into Russian occupied territory, and then just bombarding them right from both sides. I think, and this is my own opinion here, it's surprising that the Ukrainians are spending more time and effort on the Izium front than they are on the Kherson front. The northern flank, the northern part of the war, never saw Russia make a concerted effort to take Kharkiv. And this is something that's baffled as many people as possible. Just, you take Kharkiv; it's the second largest city in Ukraine. And my guess is that the resources that would be necessary to take it would divert Russia's objectives from the south. Right? You kind of notice, if you look at the map, Russia occupies large parts of eastern Ukraine and then creates this southern crescent that ends up, you look at Mariupol, Melitopol, Kherson, and others. This is Russia's attempt at taking over the northern banks of the Black Sea. So if they are as far as they are now, they have Kherson, they have yet to fully make a gain for Zaporozhye, Mykolaiv. If they take those, you kind of know, if you know anything about the narratives of Lavrov and especially Putin ever since 2014, Odessa is, if I can get a little nerdy right now, Odessa is the boss fight, right? Odessa is the one. They're going to go, and if they take Odessa, right, then it's just little more than just a day's trip to Transnistria, that little parastate, in Moldova, And Russia effectively controls Ukraine's, right? Controls the Black Sea.
Mm-hmm.
Is, inconsequential.
Yeah.
So it seems like Ukraine has kind of given up on Kherson, and Russia's just going to hold the line. And if Ukraine is putting all of its forces in, this could be, again, I don't have the crystal ball here,
Yeah.
but if Ukraine is throwing in as much of its special forces, its heavy artillery, and everything into Izium, Russia can afford to withdraw, bombard them, just knock them all out, and just drain the Ukrainian military reserves dry, and then just at their own pace, take everything back. Take it as a grain of salt. Again, some of the Telegram channels that I'm on already indicate that Russia has opened up an additional front going for Kharkiv as we speak.
Very interesting.
Again, I don't have the evidence to suggest this. We need to also remember a lot of these Telegram channels are very much pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, so they have an agenda. But if what I read was correct, right, the Russian reinforcements are not just going in to protect Izium, but there is a massive amount of reinforcements, as you rightly said. Russia has not instituted, a general call-up yet. This is still a special military operation. This is still voluntary. This is still mercenary work. The Russian army has not yet been mobilized. If that happens, then the tide of war can completely turn. And I think that this is the reason why a lot of people in February and early March were expecting this train to be over in a week, because we expected that just all of Russia was going to be mobilized. And that, if you remember, by early mid-March, Russians were already in the outskirts of Kiev.
Yeah.
They had taken the airport. They thought this was going to be over and done with. And then suddenly they all pulled back. And my guess is either one of two things. One, they realized that they were penetrating too deep into Ukrainian territory. The military supply line was in danger of being ruptured. Two, if they had taken Kiev, it would have been an absolute bloodbath. And three, again, you focus on this part of the world long enough, there's people talking behind the scenes. There's no evidence to not suggest that Putin was in contact with someone from NATO, the US, or the UK saying, pull back from Kiev, you can do whatever you want in the East. Just take it as it is.
I actually want to come with my own theory about the Kiev attack. Usually my stance on it is that I looked at the war from the very first day. I was awake at 3 a.m. to look at the developments as they happened. And from my viewpoint, I saw a lot of videos from Russian troops actually inside Kiev, inside the streets of Kiev, fighting on the very first days, the first 3 days. And so my thought about the invasion at the start is that the Russians were actually planning to take hostage Zelensky and his government and kind of overthrow the government, which was one of their goals, taking over the government of Ukraine, and that would have ended the war in the first 3 days. However, from what we can see is that, and from the data we have, the 8 years where NATO was involved in Ukraine, they didn't train the general army. They shared some intelligence and so on, but their main focus was training Ukrainian special forces to guerrilla warfare and urban warfare and so on. So I think the Ukrainian special forces at the start of the war were as powerful and as skillful as the Russian special forces. So they were able to push back the Russians who infiltrated Kiev without support, as the general army had to take multiple days and weeks to arrive to Kiev. And then at that point, they had 500-kilometer long supply lines that weren't protected. They weren't incorporated. They had no control over the territory. And the Ukrainians kept ambushing them, so it was very costly, both in manpower and equipment. So they decided to pull back because it was a disaster. And then they claimed the same as the Ukrainians are claiming now at Kherson, that it was just a ruse, a feint, so that they would focus up there. So yeah. Okay, I think we'll use the last 15 minutes to skip over the last interview questions and instead focus on the comments from the viewers. I see we have 883 viewers. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to watch. And I'm happy to have you here. Okay, so let's look at some of the questions. There's a lot of comments, but I'm having a hard time finding any questions.
Are the comments good, bad,
yeah.
what?
Rain agreements, 120 days, no attack in Odessa. So I'm assuming you're talking about the fact that they made their grain deal in Odessa and the Russians haven't used that as an opportunity. So originally, when Snake Island was given back to the Ukrainians, where Russia claimed it was a sign of good gesture, I think generally that was that the West was accusing Russia diplomatically of starving Africa as they had a complete blockade over Ukraine. And the West wanted every other country to stop buying from Russia, which essentially cut off half the food that Africa was receiving, and which is a huge issue, which would make millions starve. And I think they were diplomatically pressured generally by the international community to pull back their complete encirclement and blockade of Ukraine to allow civilian trade of grain and food products in general. So they decided to make that deal with Turkey as a broker, because even though Turkey is a NATO country, it is neutral in this conflict. And I say that because the Turkish president Erdogan, he may not be the best statesman running the country to become a paradise or whatever. It's not really the best economic situation. However, he is a very good diplomat. He takes very good advantage of all situations. For example, the United States refused to sell SAM missiles to Turkey. They then decided to buy the S-400 system. Then they were locked out of the F-35 program, and then they made a deal where they would make a deal with Finland and Sweden to join NATO in return for that. So now they have both, and Finland and Sweden are still not in NATO. So he's playing the political game very well. So yeah, generally I see that the reason why they decided not to attack is because they made this deal, they made a good gesture to the whole world, and they made it out to be the good guy in this specific situation. And then Ukraine still has huge minefields in and around the coast by Odessa, where they have some navigable routes to pass through. However, these aren't large enough for a naval invasion, even if the Russians knew the routes. So generally, it is very difficult and would be very costly and very risky. And as we have seen so far from the Russian invasion, they are not willing to take these risks. So that's my perspective on that. Do you have any comments? And I'll look through the other questions.
I mean, I remember a number of weeks ago, we're talking about the grain issue. And the Western press was very, very keen on indicating that without Ukrainian grain, large parts of the world would starve. And that was more of a narrative than actual information, for a couple of reasons. Ukraine allegedly exports somewhere around, they claim, right, around 20 million tons of grain. And there is annually anywhere from, and again, the numbers are very rough because I don't have them right here, but somewhere between 500 to 800 million tons of grain. So Ukrainians' contribution to world grain percentage is small, right? Just minute, infinitesimal. Then there was the whole idea that Africa is going to starve. So when Ukrainian ships are leaving ports with grain, where does the first ship go according to the news? It goes to Lebanon, not Africa. And Lebanese government says we don't need it, we don't want it, we have it, we've got grain. So what are you sending your stuff to Lebanon for if we need to take care of Africa? This is the problem with Africa. We like to use Africa as this problem in the world because people are starving, but yet we don't actually do anything about Africa. So, what the Ukrainians say that they export is actually larger than what both the United States and Russia says the Ukraine exports. Ukraine says we export 20 million tons of grain. The U.S. State Department, I believe, says Ukraine last year exported about 7 to 8 million tons, not the 20. To which some people in the news would say, well, the remaining 12 to 13% is now controlled by Russia, which they're doing nothing with, right? Again, I'm not on the ground. All right. I don't know this. But what I do know is that the whole idea of grain being sent to feed the world, it's largely designed, I think, by certain elements within the media to create a crisis, drive the prices up. Remember, this is a war.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to say this, but I have to say this. This is a war to make money. This is a war for many people to profit off of. Most people would think that the minute that Russia intervened at the end of February, early March, you would think that Zelensky would call for an immediate ceasefire and say, okay, look, we'll do Minsk 2, we'll, implement everything. And yet Zelensky, who was campaigning as president a few years ago on the promise of cutting a deal with Russia, reaching out to Putin, signing the Minsk 2 Accords, is now issuing all of these grandiose statements about how we're going to take back Crimea and push Russia back to its own borders. And, we're going to, liberate all of Ukraine while chiding the West for not sending them enough weapons and money. I mean, again, I'm neutral in all of this, but the man plays the part as an actor quite well here. And my guess is that he's told to do this. My guess is that he doesn't really have a lot of power. And so the grain issue is another issue where you can ship out of Odessa, but you've mined the Odessa ports to prevent a Russian naval advance. So you've kind of shot yourself in the foot, so to speak.
All right. Thank you very much for that answer. And I think we'll move on to a final question before we end the stream. And I'll go back to my own questions. And I think this is very important for everyone to know. And that is, what's the current political situation within Russia? So Russian internal politics.
We don't really know. The only people that really knows about what the internal situation is are those in the Kremlin. Western media has had a field day in saying all sorts of things, right? Putin is sick. He's on his deathbed. He has cancer. This isn't even the real Putin. There's might be a coup. All of this is unfounded. I really have to say a lot of this is just careless sensationalism. And I think that the one country that is the most responsible for this is the British. I don't know why, but British media is just making things up as they go along. And if they have evidence to the contrary, I would like to see this. As it stands now, Putin is still very much in control. His approval ratings are in the 80%. His approval ratings have never gone below 60% at any time, right? Maybe 59, 58. I mean, these are approval ratings that democratically elected leaders would love to have. But that doesn't mean that everything is fine. When one tries to describe what are the politics, what's the government within Russia? I mean, it is an autocratic state, that much is certain. But it's one that has significant approval by many people within Russia, ordinary Russians. So there's a term within political science that's used that's called stabilitocracy, right? Stabilitocracy. Russia is a stabilitocracy. Putin is a stabilicrat. And in this sense, what is it that he is pushing? What is it that he is advocating? Stability, law, order, a top-down, very patrimonial, patriarchal type of leadership. Putin has been at the helm of Russian politics for now more than 20 years. And, he has successfully demobilized much of the opposition in Russia. Talks about, Alexei Navalny, Boris Nemtsov, anybody like that. I mean, these are people that are more popular in the West than in Russia. That's not to say that there isn't any opposition against Putin, far from it. But if much of the opposition comes from urban settings in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and not from places like Omsk or Kazan or Novgorod or Vladivostok, right? His hold on power is, I think, relatively secure. One thing that we should note, and it's not talked about a lot, is that probably the biggest challenges to his potential leadership is not coming from the Democratic front, but from elements of Russia's far right, who feel that Russia is not going far enough in Ukraine, right? Why aren't they just, reducing Kiev to rubble? Why aren't they going for Kharkiv? Why are they as slow as they are? You mentioned Snake Island before and the Russian withdrawal from that, right? Everybody's going to come up with their own version of that. Ukraine was, we liberated the island. Russia is, we're pulling back as a gesture of goodwill. Everybody can say whatever they want, right? The Telegram comments, take them as they are, were, why is he doing this? You don't give up a tactical advantage, right? This is a sign of weakness. The same thing with pulling back from, Balakleya, right? You fight to the last person. Now, if the goal here is preservation of life more than territory, well, then this is going to rub the far right the wrong way. But I feel, right, that Putin may have unleashed this wave of Russian nationalism in the sense that we are now military engaged in Ukraine. How much of it are we going to take? When is Russia going to call for a ceasefire? Let's just say Russia holds the line, continues, takes Odessa, maybe even doesn't have to not, but let's just include Kharkiv as a result, and then calls it a day. Zelensky's still in Kiev. Ukraine still exists as a country, an independent country. What will that do as far as, let's say, the hardline opposition within Russia? Right now, these groups are little more than groups. They're not organized political parties. The largest political party that stands in some opposition to Putin today are the communists. And the youngest members of the Communist Party of Russia today is about 45, 46. But we're not exactly talking about a dynamic political party. So as long as the opposition remains atomized, leaderless, demobilized, right? Read your Lenin. You don't got that, you don't have opposition, you don't topple the government. So as it stands right now, Putin may very well be the best option that Russia has, because people talk about, well, what happens if Putin is removed? What happens if Putin suddenly, drops dead, something like that, right? Russia's not going to get better. My guess is that they'll find someone even worse, someone even more determined, right? Putin is the Machiavellian. And if I can use a little pop culture references here to The Godfather, Putin is Michael Corleone. You don't want Sonny. And God forbid Russia is led by Fredo. Okay. So in that sense, as unpleasant as it may be for some viewers here, right? Putin is holding all of this together. And right now, he still controls the major chess pieces on the board as of now.
I completely agree with the statement that Putin is my point of view is that he's the middle ground. The only two alternatives is the far right and communists. So unless the West wants a communist or a nationalist fascist Russia, then Putin is the man for the job. And I think what they are doing is that they are just creating this scenario where everything is better than Putin, but in reality it's not going to get better, as you say, it'll get worse. So if someone else takes control, if it's either the far left or the far right, I think stability in Russia is going to return to the 90s, where there's this mafia-led, oligarch-focused, centered, crime-ridden country, where a lot of factions are going to be fighting with each other, as rather than a middle ground, stable government, they'll have some kind of radical government that has the opposite, which is equally large in size, and it'll just be a mess in general.
Right.
So yeah, I think we'll draw it up on that. Thank you everyone who tuned in for the stream. I really appreciate all the viewerships, and thank you all for coming. And thank you, Michael, for coming onto this show. And I hope we get to see each other again.
I would be happy to do so. I would be happy to do so. If your viewers are interested, you can check out my YouTube channel. It's Michael Rossi, Poli.
Yeah.
And I'm still uploading videos. In fact, I'm working on a translation of an address that Lavrov gave a couple of days ago for Knowledge Day. Next week, there's a major SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand. I'm going to be looking for the transcript, the address that Putin gave, and I'll be providing the English subtitles as well. So anybody's interested, Michael Rossi, Poli. I'm happy to see you all. I got some papers to grade here, so.
Well, thank you very much for coming on to the stream, and thank you all for coming to watch, and thank you all so far.
Right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.